All right, that's better. Sorry about that. I was just saying hello and I was a minute late, so you guys are welcome to be a minute late and making a not so funny joke about that because we're all virtual. So anyway, here we are. Now my mic is working. So it's time for wastewater. How are you guys? Let's get the fish can going. I got a nice bug for my fish to eat the other day, and it was kind of a big bug, and the fish was took a while before it got it in its mouth all the way. Good, glad to hear that. I'm doing pretty well. Had some coffee, so I'm feeling alert enough. Ooh, geotech midterm. Doesn't sound too pleasant. Hope that went well. All right, so we're going to talk about wastewater treatment today, which surprisingly might be more pleasant than geotech midterms. Wastewater doesn't sound like a pleasant thing, but we'll see. So we looked at this graph, something from the CDC back in 1997, and this was the rate of infections, or no, actually this is deaths for typhoid fever in the US from 1900 to 1960. And one thing we noted was that chlorination began and ended up providing a really significant benefit to removing. Sorry, I need to start my pen application again. There we go. Okay, good. So that chlorination really helped provide a significant improvement in typhoid incidence. Now, one thing that you see here is that it didn't drop immediately. Now, part of that might just be because it took a while before everyone was chlorinating. But the other part may be explained by the fact that we did not have wastewater treatment. And there are two sides of the story here. One is the ingestion, but the other is proper sanitation. So if somebody is sick, how do we appropriately get the waste away and safely away from anything relevant to human activity? So indoor plumbing, wastewater treatment, all of that is crucial for that part of the equation. If you remember the beginning of class, the beginning of this course, we talked about the fecal-oral route of transmission. Well, we had the kind of the two barriers. If we're looking at the way, we've got a river flowing here and wastewater discharging in, and then maybe we want to drink a glass of water, then we want two barriers, right? So we've thoroughly covered now the drinking water barrier, and a lot of the same principles are going to apply for the wastewater, and we're shifting tracks there. So both of these are relevant for typhoid, for example. And in addition to human health, there are lots of environmental concerns. So if we take a look at essentially wastewater that we would find in developing countries, and this is kind of funny, my fish can kind of looked like it was right there as part of it. These are actually pictures that I took in Nicaragua some years back. And essentially what I'm showing you is, well, raw discharge of, well, it's not completely raw, but this is discharge in a landfill of a wastewater lagoon, which grew lots of algae, which is why this water is so green and toxic looking. It's just the green algae. But it's otherwise, it's very little treatment here. It's nasty waste flowing through a landfill. It's just an awful situation, and people are actually working in that area to try to make a living off recycling. So clearly some major waste issues here, both wastewater and solid waste. Some other pictures up here. This is a small, probably illegal or unregulated gold mining setup here, where these guys were using kind of a crude stirring system with a motor to stir mercury, probably some water in here, but a lot of this is mercury with mud, and collecting amalgamated gold from that mercury. So they're handling mercury with their hands, and then their discharge here is just into this little retention pond sort of thing that's pretty rudimentary, and then it's just seeping into the ground or escaping wherever. So there's a huge amount of mercury contamination in here for sure, and there's a lot of questions about where is that going into the environment, and is it getting into somebody's drinking water? Is it harming environmental systems? In general, you know, it's just a case scenario of really showing that we really want to control hazardous wastes, and what happens when you don't, it can be pretty disastrous. So, oops, let me come back a step. Just gonna make this a little bigger again. So in our wastewater system, you know, we looked at this graph a few times before as well, and all of this in terms of water treatment and distribution kind of encompasses all of that stuff, probably the industry as well. And so the question becomes, well, what happens when we discharge, even maybe waste from our drinking water treatment? What if that wastewater needs to go? Like, what do we do with that? So we're going to be answering that, and it's going to, we'll see that it's going to matter where our waste is coming from. Is it coming from an industrial source? Is it coming from kind of municipal sources, homes and kind of regular sewers? Or is it coming from stormwater? Like, what is our treatment? Just like our drinking water treatment was in some ways determined, the treatments that we were required were somewhat in some ways determined whether it was a stream or a reservoir or a well that we're dealing with. In the case of wastewater, the technology and the guidelines we need to meet are going to depend largely on what type of waste we're treating. A typical wastewater treatment plant will look something like this, where we have a setup with a collection system, that's our sewer system. We'll have a grit and screen chamber, much like in a water treatment plant, but in this case we're going to catch all sorts of other things. We want to catch all of the flushable wipes, but we also know that that's not actually possible. Flushable wipes are not flushable. More on that in a little bit. They just don't degrade, so they get stuck in everything. They clog the pipes, they clog the pumps, they clog the machinery. And so hopefully we catch anything like that as best we can in the screen chamber and a grit chamber. Then we go straight to primary sedimentation. So far it looks a lot like our typical water treatment. Because gravity works, a very crude separation can help. And from there, things start to change. So the sedimentation, we've learned about sedimentation. We can model that, we can describe that mathematically. For the next step, and all that, by the way, is called primary treatment. We're not expecting much benefit here aside from some basic level of cleaning up the water a little bit. We've at least settled out the solids and removed the large junk. And that does improve the water quality a little bit. So if nothing else, primary treatment is good. Ideally, we have secondary and maybe even tertiary treatment. And I don't think, tertiary is not even showing on there. Tertiary treatment would be things like nutrient removal that didn't get taken out by the secondary treatment and some other polishing steps. So secondary treatment then mainly consists of biological reactions. So the biological reactor or bioreactor here is the primary focus of secondary treatment. Now we also have sedimentation and disinfection here, The reason we have both of those is really because the bioreactor is going to be producing lots and lots of microbe cells. So in the bioreactor, whatever this looks like, we can do anaerobic, which means no oxygen, or we can bubble oxygen in there. Maybe we do some of both, but the point is that we treat the waste by letting as many organisms grow on the waste, so using the waste as food as we can. So this bioreactor then, it acts like a CSDR. It's pretty well mixed with all the bubbling typically, and it's just kind of a large tank, sometimes a sequence of large tanks. And we're going to grow lots and lots of bacteria, maybe even cyanobacteria, which is kind of algae-like. And we're going to let those bacteria chew on all the junk that's in the water and just create more and more bacterial cells, as much as we possibly can. With that, then we have lots and lots of bacteria in the solution, but we've converted some of the nasty stuff into bacterial cells. So if we had, for example, some proteins that were discharged in maybe from a restaurant, and all the cooking stuff, there's just lots of fats and proteins, don't want that in our water. These microbes are going to take that and eat it and transform it into cells. The nice thing about cells is they can be removed with physical processes, right? We can use sedimentation to settle out all of those cells that were created during the bioreaction. So in some way, we are taking something that's dissolved, something, we could think of a sugar molecule. We don't really want to be discharging lots of sugar into the environment. And I'll explain why in a second. So instead, we let the bacteria eat that and make it into a solid form, and then we can more easily take that solid bacteria, use gravity to settle it, and collect it and put it in a landfill. So the end goal is to take these dissolved stuff, whatever the junk is, whatever molecules are there, and take it, remove it as a physical, like a solid form, and then send it to a landfill, or potentially, if we treat the sludge here, we can make biosolids, which are essentially, we can use as fertilizer. It has to be treated properly. We'll talk a little bit about that in a couple lectures. So this sedimentation becomes very important again because we have all those cells, and we want to disinfect our water because we don't want to be discharging, whatever cells or viruses do escape from the sedimentation. We don't want those in our natural waters. Now, one of the reasons we don't want, let's say, sugar, for example, but any sort of dissolved organic matter, chemicals, whatever it is, the reason we don't want that in our lakes and rivers, because you think about it, sugar is pretty harmless. You could dump a tablespoon of sugar into my aquarium and probably nothing will happen. You wouldn't think about adding sugar to a lake as being a problem. But one thing that will happen, even in my aquarium, is the bacteria will grow on that sugar. Now, a tablespoon in my aquarium is probably not going to be enough to make a difference to my fish, especially with the aerators I have in there. They're constantly bubbling air. But one thing that happens if we do discharge a bunch of organic molecules, sugars, proteins, amino acids, whatever small chemicals that were breakdown products from our sewer system, whatever's in there, lots of organics, that can act as food for bacteria. And in rivers and streams and lakes, if you give the bacteria lots of food, they will start consuming all of the oxygen. So the oxygen demand is one of the key treatment parameters here, because the waste, given bacterial activity or biological activity more generally, the waste represents potential oxygen demand. So if we discharge a bunch of waste into a pond, lots of bacteria will grow and will demand all of the oxygen and take it all up, and then you have what's called you have a fish kill, and in some ways this can be eutrophication, which we'll talk about as well. So that's kind of the big picture. One of the more important things, or one of the more basic concepts of our wastewater treatment, is making it so that we are not depleting our natural waters of oxygen by discharging waste. Now, there's all sorts of other concerns. We have disinfection because we don't want pathogens in our waters. We have controls for heavy metals because we don't want heavy metals in our natural waters. There's lots of different reasons and items to consider, and we're going to talk today about the regulatory framework for these. But here's kind of the schematic picture of a typical wastewater treatment. Now, certainly most will be a little more complicated, maybe have some more specialized bioreactors, but the basics are a primary sedimentation, bioreactor, secondary sedimentation to then collect those cells, and then some sort of disinfection before discharge. Okay, so regarding regulations and standards, these are essentially based on what river, what stream, what receiving water is taking the discharge. And so the EPA delegates authority to each state, and it will also delegate that to tribal nations if they so choose. And then the state can take the authority, and almost all of the states, but I don't think any tribes have done this, but there are 2 or 3 states that leave it to the EPA and have not received this. They've not decided to take on this this requirement themselves, so they let the EPA do it on a federal level. But most states, including Louisiana, operate their own NPDES system, which is the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. So our Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality would be handling this discharge, or this system which regulates discharge to surface waters. Now, there's a very closely related system for wastewater discharges to groundwater. I'm not as familiar with that because I didn't work directly with groundwater, but I actually was an NPDES permit writer for the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality back in 2015. So I'm fairly familiar with this system, and I'm going to show you a kind of a field guide manual sort of thing that I went over and I learned during a course one time. So I'm going to tell you about that towards the end. But this system is really in charge of controlling our wastewater discharges to surface waters. And the initial goal of this system, this was first invented, so to speak, or instigated back in the 70s when, right after the time where we were having rivers and lakes catch on fire. We'll see some of that shortly. And the original goal was to eliminate all discharges of pollutants to surface waters. So just don't discharge any pollutants. That was the goal. Now turns out that's not really tenable. You can't actually achieve that. And so instead, and in the meantime, before that was, originally they said, all right, our target is to remove all pollution discharges, but in the meantime, we'll reduce it as much as possible. Well, it turns out it's not at all practical or reasonable to eliminate all pollutant discharge, in part because you can consider almost anything a pollutant. You can consider temperature as a pollutant. So if you don't match exactly what the river has, temperature-wise, you're polluting it. You can consider that, a natural river water may have lots of organics in it. It may already have a built-in biological oxygen demand just from rainwater washing soil into the river. And that's part of the natural ecosystem. But if you're then adding pristine, perfect, nothing but water molecule type water, you're actually going to dilute the system and potentially have a bad effect on it that way. So it turns out that it's not actually feasible to treat to that level. You'd have to be doing reverse osmosis. It'd be very energy intense. And for a lot of applications, it's okay to add a small amount of some waste product, maybe a small amount of sugar, for example, or a small amount of organic molecules from a tissue manufacturing or a tissue recycling, so like a paper mill type of thing, maybe a small amount of their fibrous material or the fiber molecules, it's okay to discharge them because it's not going to have a real impact on the receiving water for any of its intended uses. It's not going to impair fish or wildlife. It's not going to cause it to be unsafe to swim in. It's not going to cause it to be, impaired in any way. So this NPDES system then is there to ensure that we are protecting all of the intended uses of our waters. So there's some definitions about, okay, what is a receiving water? What is an intended use? And generally intended uses for most cases are recreation, which would include swimming, fishing, boating, that type of thing. Potentially a drinking water source. Of course, we're going to treat it before we drink it, so we don't have to have it drinking water quality out of the sewer pipe, the discharge. But you want to protect it for those intended uses and to preserve the natural wildlife. So you can't be killing fish or flora or fauna, so plants or animals in the water. You can't be adding pathogens that would make it unsafe, or heavy metals that would make it unsafe, maybe to eat fish, or pathogens unsafe to swim and do recreation in. All of these things. Now, the other thing that this system does actually helps industries, and it helps by protecting them against lawsuits if they follow their permits. So you might think that regulations, depending on your perspective, you might be of the opinion that regulations are bad for industry, are detrimental to business, and why are we regulating so hard or whatever. But there's actually an important point here because, of course, it's not a good thing to go overboard one way or the other, right? Like I discussed already, it's not reasonable to eliminate every last drop of pollutant. But what is reasonable is to protect our intended uses for society. Even if you don't want to use the bayou to swim in, maybe your neighbor does, right? You don't have, we don't want to structure our society in a way where you can ruin that for your neighbors. So when you think about an industry discharging a pollutant, if they have a permit, essentially like a license, right? They have a license to discharge. Theoretically, that license, they've paid a fee, which can be quite sizable for larger industries. This whole regulatory framework is actually self-funded by charging the industries a fee to get the permit, and that's partly based on the flow rates and things like that. So these permits can be up to 5 years long, and they'll be permitted to discharge wastewater, and then at some level, certain contamination standards have to be met. And if an industry is following their permit accordingly and in compliance with their permit, then the burden of proving that it is safe enough is actually on the EPA and the NPDES group. So that system there confirms or affirms to that industry that if you meet these standards, you are safe and not liable for killing animals or people or whatever with your discharge. So if a company or an industry has a permit to discharge and they're meeting that permit, they're following it properly, then the EPA would be on the hook, and you'd have to sue the EPA instead of the industry. So it is a good thing for industries to have standards put in place for them. If they didn't, then the industry itself would have the burden of proof to say, no, this chemical is not toxic. I don't know why those people are getting sick, but it's not us. They would have to prove with environmental studies, with toxicology studies, all of these things that prove that their wastewater is not at fault. And so most industries do not have that capability, the environmental experts and researchers to do all that, and would much rather have a permit that just says, yes, you're okay if you meet these standards. And so then they just need to meet the standards, and then they are theoretically safe, and they're not doing any harm, and they are safe from being blamed for harm. Of course, there's room for error at the permitting level, and there's room for error in terms of bad practice, misreporting, not following the permit but claiming that they are. So there's checks in place, and there's enforcement, all sorts of things to catch issues like that. So not perfect, but it's a pretty reasonable system. Okay, so let's talk about the types of pollutants that are regulated. I mentioned this already, but biological oxygen demand is one of the primary ones, and these ones that we'll talk about right now are called the conventional pollutants. So when I say conventional, really this is referring to the first set of pollutants that are more basic in terms of their scope, that were identified early on as kind of the main problems with discharging sewage into the environment, right? Biological oxygen demand, we talked about it. If the natural biology in nature is going to be excited to grow on all this food, they're going to consume the oxygen, and we're going to say that that's called biological oxygen demand, and we measure that in milligrams of oxygen per liter. That the biological process will demand from the water based on this amount of food. So it's a weird metric, right? We're measuring this in milligrams of oxygen per liter, but what it represents is the food that microbes are eating. So, we could in some way relate this to calories that people eat, right? The amount of air you're going to breathe, the amount of oxygen you're going to consume, is in some way relevant to the amount of energy you're going to consume, right? That there's a balance there where you need oxygen for your metabolism, and that metabolism is related to the amount of energy that has been taken in. Which, by the way, interesting side note, if you've ever thought about it, you might be thinking in terms of weight loss. If you wanted to lose weight or understand how weight is lost, a lot of it is actually from breathing. Now that might strike you as like, what? Well, how's breathing doing anything? Isn't it eating and and all that? Well, it turns out that when you're eating and your gut microbes are digesting stuff, you're actually just making your excrement is actually mostly just microbes, just more microbes that have grown in what on what you've eaten. And so a fair bit of that is just microbes leaving. Now, the way you lose weight then is a mass balance between the amount of oxygen you breathe in and carbon combined with oxygen, CO2, leaving. So when you're consuming food and you breathe in air and you're ingesting the dissolved organics, that's your food. Then when you breathe out, you've consumed energy, and of course you're doing cellular processes, and in this case the cells we're producing more cells for your body. Maybe you're producing more cells, maybe repairing stuff, doing some other things. So it's actually breathing that is exporting carbon. And so if you think about what is in fats are storage units for carbon primarily. So in some sense, it's actually breathing that allows or enables weight loss more than most things, is because I have either stored up extra carbon in fats as carbons that are bonded with hydrogens, probably some other molecules, some longer chain, but we have hydrogens, and then essentially when we breathe, we take a sugar or a fat, we're oxidizing that carbon and making it into CO2. That's releasing all the energy from those carbon bonds, carbon-hydrogen bonds, and we get energy from it, and then we're exhaling CO2. So if we wanted to burn fat, a lot of that's going to go out as CO2. Just a tangent, but it kind of helps us understand the way the microbes are going to be working. Yeah, so instead of going to the gym, you're going to lay in bed and breathe. I'm not recommending that as what to do, but you'll find, I think, that in order to breathe more and to actually have meaningful breathing and producing CO2, I think you do need a little more activity than just that. But it does make you wonder, in terms of your natural respiration throughout the day, how much, a little bit of activity might increase that for the whole day or something. It does make you kind of think it's not quite as simple as how many hours on the treadmill have you done, Anyway, the next conventional pollutant is simply total suspended solids, or TSS. We'll measure this in milligrams per liter. This is essentially, we take a filter and we classify suspended solids as any solids that are kind of in solution that have not settled. So give it some time to settle, any sedimentation that occurs. And with that, we'll take the water and then pass it through a filter and weigh how much does that filter weigh before and after the filtration to see, okay, how much solids were still suspended in the water. And that's, when I say suspended, that means it's not easily settleable. So that's another one, kind of how many solids are there. pH is another. It's pretty obvious how acidic or basic is the solution. You don't want to discharge highly acidic water into nature, nor do you want to discharge highly basic water. That will interfere with lots of aquatic life, very obviously. Fecal coliforms is another one. This is an indicator for pathogens. So we will use this as kind of an indicator. It's sort of a class of organisms that grow under conditions that are similar to warm-blooded gut animals, animal guts. So something that can grow in a human stomach or some other mammal's stomach. Even if some of these organisms do exist in nature, essentially we call them fecal coliforms if they grow significantly under specific conditions, that is kind of elevated temperature and certain type of nutrients. And so it's not perfect, but it is a good indication of the potential for presence of pathogens. Some of these might be pathogens, maybe some of them are E. coli, salmonella, something like that, but there are some that are harmless. We have gut bacteria in each of us, and some of those bacteria would probably not cause us any harm if we were to accidentally ingest them. But of course, some of them are going to be pathogenic. Okay, then the last one would be oil and grease. Oil and grease became very obvious when, if you can imagine a scenario where these were not regulated, you can say, okay, well, you have a lot of fish kills for no oxygen in rivers or ponds or things that have been fed lots of waste. Total suspended solids, you're just overloading a system with kind of silt-like stuff and just particulate matter. It looks nasty. pH, pretty obvious. You could have fish kills, things like that. Fecal coliforms, you take a sample and you measure how much stuff is growing, and you got a lot of stuff growing. Oil and grease, well, before it was regulated, maybe car car companies or automotive repair places dealing with a lot of oil changes, things like that. If they're just letting it run out into the street or whatever, or maybe even some manufacturing processes that deal with oils and greases. Well, if this is just discharging into your natural waters, then you can imagine if you've got a lot of industry around, your lakes and rivers will start getting coated with a layer of oil and grease at the top, and that actually caused fires to occur on rivers. So here is a picture from the Cuyahoga River, and I've got an article to show you a little bit more about it. But essentially, this ship and the river itself caught on fire. And how do you put out a river that's on fire? You know, it's like, what? what just happened? You said the river is on fire? Well, if you imagine this whole thing has, you know, an inch or half an inch of oil and grease, that can be flammable, and you have some ignition source, and then you're in some big trouble, right? The river's on fire. So I guess try to spray water that's from underneath underneath that layer, so you're not spraying oil onto the fire. That's quite a challenge. So one of the reasons we really begin to care a lot about our environment is because more and more shocking and public and in your face type of examples of environmental failures were really starting to show themselves. You know, thinking about the environment, there's an interesting dynamic, because in a very rudimentary civilization without many people, without many technologies, the environment is actually, in a lot of ways, a danger that needs to be controlled. You know, you need shelter, you need food, you need to be protected from wild animals. It's dangerous, right? And so as a society develops or a civilization progresses, you transition from the environment's being so dangerous to a point where you're saying, oh, I can make use of that environment, I can take from it, I can make my life better. And that's kind of a natural process that you would consider happening. And at some point, when you get a lot of people, get more technologies, you're essentially harming the environment to the point where it's becoming very apparent that the harm done to the environment is now feeding back as a detriment to people. So at some point, you realize that the environment needs to be in a good state for your own health or for the health of a population of people. So on the one end, if you are stranded on an island alone, the environment is mostly your enemy, and part of it's like, oh, I can find some food here and it's some sustenance. So you make use of it, and you are essentially doing everything you can to protect yourself from the environment. At some point, you shift to, we need to protect the environment because we're causing it so much harm that we are no longer able to use it for what we want and what's good for us. So this is a kind of one of those tipping moments where the environment was in such bad shape, especially around these industries and all that, where it was becoming a very big problem and a very apparent one. You also have to realize that as a society develops, you have more freedom to enjoy the environment. And if you're never fighting against it because you have modern conveniences and utilities, you've got power, you've got water, you've got sewage, all of these things, then the environment really becomes something to enjoy, to go out in nature, to do recreation or whatever. So the environment still maintains lots of importance, and the relationship sort of shifts. So we still want to protect it because people care about it. Maybe not every single one of you loves going and fishing and catching little fish from the stream or whatever to put in your aquarium, but certainly some of us like that type of thing. And so because some of society cares, then we all ought to be invested in protecting it. So this is a kind of one of those tipping moments where we see that change. Now I've got a more current example of a river on fire And we've got a video here. So give me just one moment. Pull this up. So in more recent terms, we had a river on fire, and this was in Russia, but this was because of a burst pipeline. I'm gonna see if I can get this into full screen. I'm going to make, okay, I think there should be sound too, so be prepared for that.
О, смотри, этот вертолет, значит точно уже что-то вышло.
Обалдеть.
So this is a river, I think it's in Russia, maybe in Moscow. You can see that it's just an intense blaze. So apparently there was some sort of an oil pipeline that burst there, and that's what a river on fire looks like. So perhaps it wouldn't be quite that bad, but I don't know. Maybe that is a good description of what it looked like. So, and it didn't just happen once back in the 60s. This has happened on multiple occasions, and people, you know, it was common enough of an occurrence that, you know, it was pretty terrible. So then there's an article here, this next link, and I think I've got we've got a PDF of that article posted, I think. But this kind of documents how the Cuyahoga River fire sort of helped instigate the U.S. EPA and the Clean Water Act. So take a look there if you wish, and I'm going to provide a quote from there in a little bit. So clearly, we don't want rivers on fire, and that would fall under that conventional class of pollutants. Now, the next class would be toxics. Toxics being heavy metals and organic compounds that are classified, specific compounds that are classified as issues. So that would include things like benzene, which is often found in petroleum products, toluene, xylene, things like that. Anything that is at all common or found in industries that is a harmful organic compound have probably made their way onto that toxics list. That list is updated every few years, and it's certainly something that new molecules, new chemicals can be added to. Then we have non-conventional. So non-conventional includes everything except those conventional ones and except for toxics. So weird way to say it, but this is the kind of the standard. So non-conventional would include chlorine. So if we're chlorinating our wastewater, then we need to dechlorinate it after we've had that chlorination contact time, at least to safe levels. Because if you're discharging a bunch of chlorine can harm wildlife. In fact, one of the kind of the funny permits that I would do for my permit writing was swimming pools. Swimming pool operators had to have permits. Now, swimming pool operators are in no way considering themselves to be like an industry, right? But they actually have to discharge lots of pool water every now and then to take it down for maintenance or to do cleaning, maybe do a flush of the water. And if you've never thought about it, well, our typical wastewater treatment plants might do, a few million gallons per day on a daily basis of wastewater discharge. Now you take a swimming pool that's been operated for a while, maybe it's got some junk in it, probably has a lot of chlorine in it, and you say, okay, well, tomorrow I want to take the pool down, we'll do a full flush of the system, maybe drain it for 8 hours, and then we'll refill it next week after we've cleaned it. So you take an Olympic swimming pool, and that's, I don't remember how many, but it's multiple millions of gallons. And if you do that over the course of one day, that's several million gallons per day. And even if it happens once a year, that's a big discharge. And so if that all had chlorine in it and there was no steps involved to reduce or remove the chlorine, that becomes a big problem. And so they actually needed permits to discharge their pool water. Ammonia would be here, so it's kind of another nutrient issue, nitrate, nitrite, phosphorus, and really whatever else that was not a conventional and is not a toxic. So there's plenty more that we could probably find. A non-toxic organic compound that ruins the aesthetics of the water, maybe some sort of a dye, would probably fall under the non-conventional. Anything that did not fit in these other ones would be non-conventional, and then there's a few that are kind of the standard non-conventional pollutants. So that's how the permitting system, the regulatory framework, sets it up in these three different categories. Okay, so I have a video here, and I need to just go ahead and go with it. So this one, I mentioned flushable wipes earlier, and this is the reason we don't want flushable wipes. Okay.
Flushable wipes getting stuck in the sewer systems.
I have never seen one dissolve.
They have to remove them on a daily basis.
Okay, so you see that flushable wipes are not actually flushable. And if you didn't know that, now you do. Usually when I do this in class, everybody's kind of jaw dropped in shock to actually look at it that way. Okay, so how are companies allowed to market them as flushable? Well, who gets to say, right? If users found that they clogged the toilets every time, they probably would complain and say, oh, this is false advertisement, whatever. But when it's not the end user that realizes that there's a problem, then who is going to do that, right? So there's a bit of a question there in terms of who gets to say that. Now it's up to the wastewater treatment plant to complain to who? To the companies? To lobby legislators? It's a tricky situation because it's a pretty bad thing for for wastewater treatment plants and for sewer systems. But what are they going to do about it? There's companies that produce it, and they don't have any direct modes of action to say, hey, you can't do that. So it's pretty unfortunate. Anytime if you talk to any wastewater operator, you'll probably hear the same exact thing. This is a problem, we need. It would be good to have something in place to fix that, and it probably requires some sort of regulatory action on the way wipes are marketed, as silly as that sounds. in my view, it's probably best to have, err on the side of less legislation, less bureaucracy and everything. But in that case, that might be worth it to save our municipality some money there, and ourselves, right? We, as a society, we pay for our wastewater treatment, at minimum in a roundabout way. Now, how would you like to be that person that's like digging out fatbergs and in the sewer, in your hazmat suit, trying to deal with that? I'm sure that would get paid very well, but aside from the pay, that who knows? Doesn't look very pleasant. Okay, so in line with that, and now that you've got your mind on non-flushable wipes, oh wow. Okay, so one of you has done that. Hopefully it paid well. It doesn't strike me as the summer internship I would think about normally, but I'm sure that was interesting, even if it wasn't so fun. So in thinking about that, we have to think about how to remove this stuff or give the best shot at removing it. So I wanted to take a quick look at what mechanical screens or grit chambers that are automated will look like. So here's one more YouTube, just kind of showing a little bit about that type of thing. This is just some advertisement from some company. And it's essentially just showing what's happening as water with particles and stuff is flowing through the system. It's collecting all the grit, all the particles, and every now and then it's kind of sieving it and collecting, and eventually dumping that collected stuff into a little chamber. And this would be all be happening kind of mechanically, and it would just this would slide back down and repeat the process. So I've seen these in operation. They are nasty looking mess, but they do the job, and the chambers that these types of systems are in tend to end up having a lot of debris around them, just because there's just junk flowing through, and it's just a messy situation. So not the most pleasant part of wastewater. You're dealing with raw wastewater and raw junk that's coming in, and then putting that into some sort of a container for landfilling. Okay. So with that, actually, let me make sure that's paused. With that, I wanted to show you a little bit from this wastewater permit writers course that I took. I've got a PDF that's posted to Moodle. I'll make sure that it is posted and visible. Haven't checked. And I'm sorry, I didn't put these slides up yet, but I will. So this permit writers course was interesting. Last time I was telling you about my experience dabbling in public health and taking a week-long course in public health. Well, in this case, I was already married, so I wasn't looking for a wife or anything. And so this week-long course was not nearly as interesting. The topic in general is kind of interesting, how are things regulated? But I will say that when you're sitting in an office space with a bunch of people, mostly you don't know, and this was actually in Chicago. We took a small road trip to go to it. And then you've got these wastewater people, these regulatory people that are coming and talking to you. But they're not just talking to you, they're lecturing to you in a monotone voice that sounds something like this, and it drones on and on with almost no facial expression for about 30 minutes, and you just want to sleep. You see, it just puts you to sleep. So one week of that, I was ready to go back to academics. I had already been thinking about looking into getting a postdoc. So I ended up by that point I was contacting the guy who eventually became my postdoc at Michigan State, my postdoctoral advisor. So anyway, the this permit writer course, it was very in depth. It was good training, but it was a little bit difficult at times. Okay, so I wanted to show you a couple things here. This is just that article, just the PDF version. Definitely take a look. I think I posted this online as well. But I also have the permit writers course here, and I wanted to just walk you through a couple of the chapters here. I encourage you to take a look. So the first chapter is really on what's the regulatory framework look like and how do we do it. So the overview of the Clean Water Act, Module 1. So Module 1 and 2 I'm going to touch on today. There's lots of other ones. This water treatment processes might be interesting. A lot of it ends up kind of dry, but feel free to take a look. It's a resource that I had, and I felt is kind of interesting, at least some of the overview. Now, and just try to imagine it in the most monotone voice you can. No, okay. Okay, so early on, the first legislation that dealt with anything remotely related to wastewater was the Rivers and Harbors Act, 1899. Then that was really dedicated to navigation in particular. 1948, we had the Federal Water Pollution Control Act that added more navigation concerns, regulations, and then started the first steps towards health concerns relating to water quality as well. 1965 put out the Water Quality Act, and that was the first one that really required standards for interstate water, so waters that cross different state boundaries. So it seems like one of the first things that happened was that one state would complain about a shared body of water that another state was perhaps not treating so well, and so there was some drama between states in that regard. So that picture, by the way, this was from 1952, and in an August 1st, 1969 article in Time magazine, we have this quote: "Some river, chocolate brown, oily, bubbling with subsurface gases, it oozes rather than flows. Anyone who falls into the Cuyahoga does not drown," Cleveland citizens joke. Grimly, he decays. And then another dry quote here, typical government quote: "The Federal Water Pollution Control Administration dryly notes, the lower Cuyahoga has no visible signs of life, not even low forms such as leeches and sludge worms that usually thrive on wastes. It is also literally a fire hazard." Pretty crazy description there. So in 1970, EPA was established by executive order, and along with that, a Refuse Act permit program was established as an executive order. Well, that was ruled like that it was maybe unconstitutional or something, so that was struck down in federal court, and then Congress began to fashion a program from its own legislation. So we see that some initial action was taken, but it needed to be calibrated. It was, there was a check and balance here, but the movement in this direction, was a good thing. So, maybe to be optimistic about our government system, which there's lots of reasons and people that want you to feel pessimistic about things. I think pessimism sells better than optimism. So if you're at all connected to information sources, chances are they're capitalizing on your attention, and pessimism gets more attention. So here's a reason to be optimistic, right? Since you're paying me for some information. It seems like this was a good progression of government, in this case, I guess, an executive order was created for something that was important that needed to happen. It was not quite right, so there was the check and balance. And then over the next years, we had the calibration of the EPA and progress towards a system that would be protective of our environment, but also checked in terms of not being overbearing and unconstitutional, taking away rights, things like that. So maybe there are still problems. Ideally, no one would pollute and no one would ever be harmed, and there'd be no one ever needing to be regulated. But that's silly land. Okay, so in 1972 and on to present here, we have the Federal Water Pollution Control Act amendments. That's kind of the core of the NPDES program that we would have today. The Clean Water Act was added in 1977. That really focused in on the priority pollutants and providing effluent guidelines. You may not discharge more than this amount. Kind of dealing with some of those, those priority pollutants. Okay, this one's toxic. We cannot allow anybody to be discharging it. Then the Water Quality Act in 1987. That one focused on water quality-based effluent limits and added stormwater control. So in that case, if you had a stream or river that was, it was really important that for the wildlife in that stream or river that the water quality maintained some specific status, then you have to treat or set your effluent limits based on that water quality need. And there's a few special circumstances where that might be particularly important. We designated a few waters as, national, it's kind of like, national parks. It's like a very special body of water that is particularly pristine. Lake Superior in Michigan, for example, and many of its tributaries are designated with this classification that it basically needs extra protection. Some of the waters that salmon habitate and spawn in are going to receive extra protection because the salmon populations require that clean water up the streams and the ability to migrate up the streams to spawn. And it's not just that we like the pristine, perfect streams to hike next to or whatever. It's also that we are relying on a lot of these for large fisheries, so significant components of our economies. Okay, so in 1972, the initial Federal Water Pollution Control Act, what it was doing was it had the objective to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. The national goals and policies here included to eliminate the discharge of pollutants to navigable waters by 1985. Just eliminate, no more pollutants, right? I know we talked about that earlier. As an interim goal to achieve by July 1st, 1983, wherever attainable, a level of water quality that provides for the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and provides for recreation in and on the water. So that there is the key and kind of the foundation that, that first goal, eliminate all discharge, did not turn out to be practical. So instead, the secondary goal was actually a very good goal because it was not only potentially achievable, but it was also really looking at the important components that really were going to protect waters for their intended uses. So lastly, prohibit discharge of toxic pollutants in toxic amounts. Now we talked before about dose making the poison. If we have toxic pollutants, we want to make sure that they are we're not discharging them in a dose that will cause problems, right? So if we're going to discharge toxics, it better not be in toxic amounts. Maybe we can manage tiny discharges of toxic pollutants if they're not going to do any harm. That would be fine. Okay, so this led to the construction, the establishment of this NPDES system, different programs associated with industrial pretreatment. If an industry is discharging to a municipal sewer plant, water treatment plant, then a wastewater treatment plant, then they might need some pretreatment in case you might have some very aggressive chemicals in your industry, and then you send that down the sewer line, and all of a sudden you've killed that biological reactor. You killed all the biology in that biological reactor, and you have no more microbes doing the work. So maybe it was just a really intense pH shock that the industry sent down the pipes. That's a big problem. So there are certain pre-treatment things that are required so that the industry is not causing the wastewater treatment plant, the municipal one, to fail or to miss their treatment, their effluent guidelines. So there's that pre-treatment stuff, and then there's construction grant programs established for communities that need to upgrade their wastewater treatment plants but aren't able to. That's what that's about. The maximum permit term limit is 5 years. Sometimes it's just 1 year at a time for big permits or really important stuff. There's a whole host of other things that are established here. Sometimes you'll treat something based on the best technology that can treat a particular type of contaminant. So for example, if you have a leaky underground storage tank from a gas station or a dry cleaners, sometimes that type of a setup, you're actually not going to prescribe an effluent guideline. Instead, you're going to prescribe the technology required. You must use this type of technology within some standards, your engineering practice, because we know if treated to this extent, this amount of activated carbon or whatever, then we know that your effluent should be okay. So we prescribe the technology and monitor. Of course, there are compliance deadlines. Already mentioned that the authorized states to take this permitting program. And it really set up this permit compliance as a shield, a kind of a protective shield for industries. And of course, if somebody is violating the permits, there are potentially enormous financial fines, and potentially their permits can be revoked, which would generally just kill the industry outright, because if they violated their permits and they're not in compliance, then it becomes a federal issue and probably a felony to continue discharging without the permit. Okay, so 1976, the Natural Resources Defense Council consent decree established this list of toxic priority pollutants. We'll take a glance at that list in a moment, and kind of touched on a couple other things, including a list of primary industries, 21 of them as of 2015, where these specific industries were known to have specific types of contaminants and pollutants, and so they had these technology-based effluent standards for specific to their categories. I mentioned that a moment ago, and that so maybe a paper mill would be prescribed, you must use this type of technology because we know it's going to work, and we know it's going to be going to take care of the particular types of pollutants that you'll probably see. Okay, more things and stuff here. Not too noteworthy. 1987, the stormwater stuff came in, and we also at that time allowed Indian tribes or Native American tribes to be considered as states in terms of the jurisdiction. To my knowledge, none of them have accepted that at this point. Another thing that was added there was a federal sludge management program. So we can now have some regulation about what we do with the sludge, because there's actually lots of nutrients and lots of potential use for that sludge. It's kind of a concentrated pile of stuff that would normally be microbe food. And so it has a lot of potential uses. And it kind of increased the penalties for non-compliance at this point. You know, the program had been running for over 10 years now, and so they really kind of beefed up their system and the enforcement. Okay, some more stuff I'm going to skip through a little bit here. Talks about what is a permit. You can think of it as a license to discharge, but it can be revoked for cause. So if somebody's not holding to the permit, and essentially you can think of it like a driver's license. So there's one important definition here is a point source versus a non-point source. So a point source, a discharge of wastewater from a point, or what we call a point source. This is any discernible, confined, and discrete conveyance, including but not limited to pipes, ditches, tunnels. There is a challenge here with agricultural irrigation systems are ditches that convey water, and they typically have lots and lots of nutrients in them because of all the fertilizer. And so when you get agricultural runoff, it becomes somewhat impossible to properly regulate them according to these standards because of all that nutrients that's required to grow the plants. So unless we just wanted to stop farming, we kind of have to not include that until we can find a better way to regulate them. So they are not included in this. So that's kind of a noteworthy exception. That's part of the reason we get so much phosphorus in our Mississippi River, to a large extent up far north, which all of that does end up kind of impacting the Gulf and the dynamics of the water quality in the Mississippi. Okay, other stuff about pollutants. One thing to note here is the NPDES system does not have jurisdiction or authority over ships. So vessels that have sewage or other wastes like ballast water, they are regulated separately. I believe under the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is under the Department of Commerce. So their regulations are kind of separate and different because we don't want ships coming inland and then discharging, in the Mississippi or wherever, a bunch of wastewater. So there's some important concerns there. That's a related topic, but different regulatory framework. So here's those classes of pollutants: conventional, toxic, non-conventional. And one of the key definitions here is I've talked about receiving waters, and the regulations actually refer to waters of the US, waters of the United States. Some of the old regulations refer to navigable waters because most of the stuff was navigation centric. But really most of our regulation has been expanded to say waters of the US, which includes just about anything except for something like a wastewater treatment lagoon. So a pond that is dedicated to wastewater treatment, of course, we're not going to regulate that. It is doing wastewater treatment. So there's only a few exceptions, but waters of the US include all interstate waters, all waters that are neighboring a tributary or wetlands adjacent. So wetlands adjacent to identified waters up here. So all sorts of waters. The exceptions are basically those, the ditches for agriculture, and if you're using it for wastewater treatment, you have a wastewater treatment lagoon. There's been some Supreme Court rulings talking about these things, establishing more clarity, things like that. There is a groundwater discharge program. Groundwater is not included in waters of the US, but groundwater does have a separate treatment requirement. So there's an entire regulatory framework for groundwater discharge of wastewater. It happens sometimes, but it has its own permitting process. It is similar to the NPDES, but not the same. Okay, I mentioned the ponds and lagoons. So I'll probably wrap up. I do want to scan through in a second to find those lists of the priority pollutants for you, but essentially we'll wrap up with this. So June 20th, 2009, again, and this one's in the New York Times. The first time Gene Roberts fell into the Cuyahoga River in 1963, he worried he might die. Mr. Roberts smelled so bad that his friends ran to stay upwind of him. Recently, he returned to the river carrying his fly fishing rod. In 20 minutes, he caught 6 smallmouth bass. It's a miracle, he said. 58. The river has come back to life. Today, the Cuyahoga River is home to more than 60 species of fish, said Jim White, executive director of the river's community planning organization. It coordinates cleanup efforts. Beavers, blue herons, and bald eagles nest along the river banks. And I happen to know that smallmouth bass they're pretty picky about their water quality. They won't hang around in water that's dirty or too hot. They like cool, clean water. So that's a remarkable testament to what our wastewater permitting and wastewater control, wastewater treatment has done for the wildlife there. You can take a look at which waters are technically impaired. Some of these are just naturally impaired. There's some interesting details there in what way are we defining impaired, and how do the lakes and rivers compare to the lakes and streams compare to the rivers and streams compared to the lakes and ponds. Okay, so here's priority pollutants. So we see stuff like benzene, benzidine, acrylonitrile, dimethyl phthalate, pyrene, toluene, vinyl chloride, all sorts of stuff here. Includes some of the toxic metals, so arsenic, asbestos is in there. It's not a metal, but it's a mineral. Cadmium, chromium, copper, cyanide, lead, all these things, right? So there's a bunch of priority pollutants. And I think we'll end it there. Certainly take a look if you're interested. It's quite a big system. Here's a quick look at who all is fully or partially authorized for the different programs. This was again May 2015. It may have changed. Looks like Texas has full authorization, including biosolids. Michigan did. Louisiana does not at that time. Okay. Anyway, that's all we've got time for. So with that, we'll start getting into wastewater microbiology and how to model some of this mathematically next time. So I'll hang out here for a second if you got questions. If not, we'll see you on Thursday. All right, take care.